Thank you. So we want to welcome everyone to Chatham Rotary today. Our guests include our pianist, Julia Smith, as well as Cheryl and Bruce Ross. So thank you very much for attending, and to Bruce, who is going to be speaking to us shortly. We have on Zoom today Donna Litwin-Makey, one of our Rotarians, as well as a good friend of Bruce and Cheryl. And Dr. Chandrasena is in the background here. Pretty sure he's squeezing us in between probably many things that he's doing. No, it looks like he's at home right now. Welcome, Dr. Chandrasena, as well. So we'll start our meeting with happy thoughts, and I'm going to let, well, actually, I'm going to charge Bruce for this happy thought. I showed up at the signing for his book signing, and I was really disappointed because I had to wait in a line of about 25 people before I could get up about an hour and a half later to see him. And as everybody knows, we want to congratulate him on getting this book out. And I know just even talking to us today, he's a little on the anxious side. So it just go with the flow, Bruce. This is how things are. So any other happy thoughts that anybody would like to put out there? I'll get more into our meeting afterwards, and we have some other things that are on the go there as well. So as we always do, Donna, happy birthday a little earlier this month. Barry Fraser's birthday was March 10, and Keith Dawson has a birthday coming up March 18. Our club anniversaries are Laurie Marshall for 3 years and Monica Rambor for 7 years. So that takes care of that part of things. So we're going to head in and we're going to try to put this together. We are trying to do Zoom, and we're trying to do a computer presentation, and we just hope it all goes. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. I have a biography on Bruce, and I'd just like to present this to you first. Bruce moved to Chatham in 1987. That's a long time ago, Bruce, to accept a position with Unigasco Credit Union, now known as Main Street Credit Union. He remained there until he retired in April 2019. He and Cheryl's a retired high school music and French teacher, have been married 26 years, and they have a daughter, Hannah, who is finishing her 3rd year at McMaster University. In August of 2021, Bruce and Cheryl made the move to Meaford to be closer to Cheryl's daughter, Carmen. Bruce has joined the Meaford Rotary Club. Obviously, he had a good start here, so he continued up there. He's joined what's called the Beaver Valley Provost Club. I'll let him explain that. And he's also the treasurer of the Meaford Pickleball Club. So I know when he left here, he was kind of keeping quiet that he could do treasury details, at least to the Rotary Club. And but he's already jumped in and taken care of things for the Meaford Pickleball. Bruce has lived with depression and anxiety for his entire adult life, more than 45 years. Today, he is going to share his journey with depression that has culminated in his recent published book titled Breaking Free of Depression's Grip, a powerful success story. Bruce, it's all yours. Good luck.
Hey, Donna.
Hi.
Well, thank you very much, Brett. Thanks very much for the kind introduction, and great thanks everybody for being here. I'll just go through a brief presentation. Normally, I like to walk around the room a bit, but because of the Zoom presentation, I have to kind of stay here behind the podium, but that's okay. So first, I just want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Chandrasena, who, as Brett has mentioned, is a very busy individual, but he took time out of his busy schedule to chime in today through Zoom. He's been instrumental with me to be with me during this journey for the last 30 years, probably 25 years anyway. And it has been great. It helped me continue along the path where I am today. So thank you, Dr. Chandrasena. So I'll just go through a fairly brief presentation, about 20 slides. It encompasses really three areas. It talks about depression in general. I know depression's been in the news, obviously, through COVID, with the onset of COVID. Just to talk a little bit about that, to clarify some of the items there. Then I'll talk about my own particular journey, where I've come from, where I've gone. And then also talk a little bit about the book. It's not a sales job here, but I will fill you in on that. I'm certainly appreciative of all the people that attended, the Rotarians that attended my book signing on the weekend, and that went extremely well. Paul was there, Allison was there, Brett was there, Tanya was there, Jennifer, Tony, Ford, and Jane. Did I miss anybody? Karen, of course, yeah, Les was there. So awesome. Thank you very much for the show of support, and that Brett kind of rallied the troops. That made me feel it was very uplifting, frankly. I was a little, as Brett said, I was a little nervous about coming back to Chatham. It's been a while since I've been here. And even though I lived here for 34 years, there's still some angst whether or not anybody kind of remembers you, but it was extremely uplifting and very, very rewarding, frankly. Great feeling. Be kind of sad to leave again, but it will be going back to Meaford right after this. So anyway, we'll get started here. I just want to take a minute to talk about depression types. This is coming from obviously from non-academic, not a clinical individual, but depression is used in a very much a generic context, much the same way as cancer is. Cancer just used generically, but there's actually a number of different types of cancer. Obviously, depression is no different. I'll just go through them very briefly. Bipolar disorder, one we've heard of, used to be called manic depression, but that's where you have the highs and the lows, the very dramatic swings in moods. So that's a type of depression. Perinatal or postpartum depression. Perinatal is more surrounding the birth. The postpartum is after birth, but they're somewhat used interchangeably. So that's a fairly well-known depression. Premenstrual disorder is another type of depression. It's not new apparently, but it's kind of come to more of the forefront, more recognized than it used to be. Apparently it's an extreme case essentially of premenstrual syndrome. So that's what that is like. There's a psychotic depression, and that is really what you hear, particularly in the States with the school shootings, where, unfortunately that's where you hear, somebody has delusions or hallucinations and that type of thing, hearing voices and that type of thing. And then there's seasonal affective disorder, the appropriate acronym SAD, and that affects people in northern climates such as ours, where you have less sunlight in the fall and winter. So that's a type of depression, but that's more, as the name suggests, seasonal. And then we get down to persistent depressive disorder, and that's bolded because that's one of the things I've suffered from. And we'll get to that, we'll expand on that in a minute. And then there's major depressive disorder. So that's another type of depression too, as the name suggests, it's more serious. Not that they all aren't, but it's certainly major. And we'll expand on that in a minute too. And that's one I dealt with for sure. So 2 of the 7 listed here. And it depends what website, what source you're getting your information from dictates how many types of depression there are. But this is from the National Institute of Health in the United States in Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very respected organization. So that's where these depression types, I got the information from. Just briefly talk about some of the causes of depression. It's interesting because as far as I can tell, from a non-clinical person, Dr. C could chime in here if he wants, but the medical sector doesn't really have yet a firm understanding of the causes of depression. There's certainly numerous assumptions and some presumed causes, but there's nothing concrete yet to kind of definitively suggest the cause of depression. But one noted one, which it's bold because I believe that applies to me, is brain chemistry, especially when, and that seems to make sense, especially when, you think of all of the changes that take place during puberty, during your teens. And that's when a lot of the depression has been kind of traced back to for a lot of individuals, including myself. So that's one that's pretty recognized, but again, not definitively yet deemed to be a cause of depression, but assumed to be. Environment is kind of a bit of the elephant in the room that people don't really want to talk about. I firmly believe that in my case, that was I've been a contributor to my depression. I'll just briefly touch on it, and that is that I grew up in a very emotionally disconnected household, and I'll leave it at that. And I'm no different than anybody else. I understand, appreciate totally that it's in our society, it's very taboo to talk negatively about your parents. So I'm no different. So I'll leave that one, but I do believe environment is certainly a significant contributor. Genetics, that is one where the medical sector does point the finger at depression, so to speak. There seems to be, as with many other physical illnesses, which depression is, genetics plays a great role. So I believe that's the case with myself. I look at my two brothers and my father when he was alive, and my own grandfather. They were never diagnosed with depression because they never went to doctor, but I'm sure they would have been if they had it. A couple other causes of depression, life events such as death of a loved one, for example, that doesn't apply to me. That's why it's not bolded. Medical conditions, so if you have significant illness like cancer, for example, that can contribute to depression. And medications apparently can trigger some depressive events. But I think the top three are that have contributed to my challenges. That whether or not I'll ever find out the real cause or how much contributed, I'll probably never find out, but that's okay. I'll leave you with some statistics. Just I'm a little bit wary of giving out statistics because I find they're a little bit slanted depending on who they're geared to. But to give you an idea, there's 280 million individuals worldwide who suffer from depression. And the 1 in 4 Canadians, this is taken straight, I think, from the Canadian Mental Health Association source. 1 in 4 Canadians have a degree of depression to need treatment at some time in his or her life. Major depression, 1.6 times out of women versus men. And this is kind of interesting because I don't believe they really know if that's true, whether or not women do suffer from depression more, or it's more that women are more apt to talk about depression. Competitive. So 70% of mental health problems have their onset during children or adolescents. So this makes perfect sense. And why we see many advertisements on TV now geared to mental health for adolescents, because that's where they believe that a lot of the depression stems from. One sobering thought is 4,000 Canadians per year die by suicide. That's about 11 per day, so that's pretty significant. And of course, you can't have any presentation without tying COVID into it. And I think it's well known that depression and other mental health issues have risen significantly since COVID. So in this statistics, what the source was 70% increase in rating of high. So it just gives you some backdrop. So that's just some, as I say, non-academic, non-clinical perspective on depression. Put it in perspective. For my particular case, the timelines expand on that a little bit. So I've been diagnosed with the persistent depressive disorder, also known, I guess the old term is dysthymia or dysthymia, however you pronounce it. So since high school, since the mid-70s. So I struggled with that for about 20 years, but I didn't know what it was because if you remember back in the 70s, depression really wasn't a non-issue. It was what you knew of depression or mental health issues was through watching one called the Kukoc test. And I knew I didn't have that. Unfortunately, I didn't have the relationship with my parents to talk about my challenges, and it really was unrecognized. And so I struggled on my own for about 20 years until about 1995. And it was actually thanks to Cheryl. After married for a short while, Cheryl actually came to me and said, Brooks, I think you suffer from depression. And perhaps surprisingly, I didn't become defensive. In fact, there was some relief because after all these years of searching, I felt like a prisoner on the run who was finally ensnared, so to speak, captured. And there was some relief that I thought my challenges were over. I thought, you I'd accept the fact that I might be dealing with this illness and could move on to recovery. Fortunately, that wasn't to be. I'll get to this in a minute, but I was also, this is what the time Dr. Chandrasena entered into the picture. And along with persistent depressive disorder, which we'll talk about in a sec, he also diagnosed him with generalized anxiety disorder. So GAD, I guess, is the acronym. So I had that double whammy. And then I encountered major depressive disorder, which most people are familiar with, severe depression, clinical depression, that's called, or just simply depression. So when people talk about depression, this major depressive disorder is quite often what they're referring to. So that was 2006. I was actually off work for 7 months and on long-term disability and so forth. Just to expand a little bit on persistent depressive disorder, this is really a chronic condition, but a low mood, low, sad, dark mood, whatever you can call it, where you can function every day, but life is not very particularly fulfilling. You feel unfulfilled, really. And I guess the greatest example of that is think of Eeyore and the Winnie the Pooh character, right? He's there's a cloud over his head and stuff like that. And that's how I felt, for years. And some of the other signs are, as on the slide here, poor appetite, that's me. Insomnia, that's me. Fatigue, that's me. Low self-esteem for sure. Poor concentration. The only thing I didn't have was hopelessness. I always had hope, and I don't know what I contributed that to. I was a very analytical person. And so I did a lot of years and hours, spent a lot of time trying to analyze why I felt this way. But I don't know why I continued to have hope. And that is one thing that certainly spurred me on. Now, major depressive disorder, or again, clinical depression or severe depression, it's perhaps shorter term, doesn't have to be the 2 years. So it's not the chronic one, but this is the one most people relate to. Depressed mood, diminished interest, and there are asterisks there because they're part of the criteria that need to be there. And then the other ones, including psychomotor agitation, so maybe fidgeting your hand, rubbing your hands, fidgeting, that type of stuff. And then this one includes also suicidal thoughts. So that's pretty scary. Generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, persistent worrying and so forth. Inability to let go of the worry. And I struggled for years. I always worry about something, no matter what, even though I knew logically things were going well. From a practical perspective, I always worried. I always had to have something occupy my head, I guess. So I don't know. So generalized anxiety disorder is sometimes referred to as a twin sister of the depression. It's quite often accompanies it. And although the symptoms are a little bit different, they kind of go hand in hand with depression. So some of the treatments, I've been through the whole gamut of treatments. It started off with my family doctor at the time, who's no longer in practice. He prescribed me Prozac, which, if you remember, was a wonder drug a number of years ago. That didn't work, so Cheryl's doctor was Dr. John Button, who's a friend of the Rotary, right? And has since passed away, junior doctor. So that's when he came into the scene. He did. He referred me to a couple of physical treatments. So not treatments, but prognosis. Lost word here. Help me out here. Gerald, help me out. Yeah, diagnosis. So he sent me to a sleep disorder clinic in London because I always had trouble sleeping. Allergy test to see if there was an allergy to mimicking depression, and thyroid test, because apparently a malfunction in your thyroid will mimic depression. Those came back negative, so we marched on. Been on about 20, so many I've forgotten, but I've lost track. It's over 20 different medications. And what happened was Dr. Button started off with the standard treatments of medications, prescriptions. And then when it got out of his realm, that's when Dr. Chandler Senior came into the scene. And so Dr. Button and Dr. Chandler Senior kind of split the medications. I've known some of them in isolation, some of them augmented other medications. So this going forward, as Dr. Chandler Senior entered the scene, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, pretty standard and recognized treatment method in conjunction with medication to solve the depression riddle. I understood it from a logical basis, but didn't really resonate with me emotionally, unfortunately, even though I had a great therapist. So that was kind of ruled that out. And then a kind of an unusual one, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a recognized but fairly unheard of method for treating depression. In fact, Dr. C, I believe, has a machine in his office now in Chatham, just up the street. And what they do is I went to a clinic in Toronto, just about 15 years ago, and really essentially they put a coiled plate, really a metal plate on your head, and shoots electronic magnetic impulses into your brain where the depression resides, and it helps you alleviate the depression. So that did seem to help. I was there for 2 weeks for about an hour each day, but it wasn't covered by OHIP or my employer insurance. So it was very expensive. I believe $6,000 out of pocket. So that really wasn't the solution. And worse, the worst part didn't last, right? So I couldn't just keep going back. So that was kind of ruled that out. Then it came to the dreaded ECT, again, one flew with cuckoo's nest. Unfortunately, it's obtained a bad reputation as a result of that. But apparently ECT is actually one of the most recognized and effective methods for treating major depression worldwide. So this was Dr. C helped me with that. Well, he took care of that for me. He was, I believe there were 18 treatments, I believe it was, that he was to conduct on me. And I think most people are familiar with ECT, where they put the electrodes in your head, put you under with anesthesia, and put some mild electric current to your brain. But I was supposed to have 18 treatments, and Dr. C, I think, stopped it after 10 days or something because it wasn't effective. So they kind of ruled that out. So on me March. Ketamine was another professional treatment that thanks to Dr. C, that we tried. Ketamine, for those people who remember, is actually a hippie drug from the 1960s. And I think lately it's been abused as a date rape drug. But if used in moderate cases, it'll actually help reduce depression. In fact, it was on the cover of Time magazine a couple years ago as one of the most promising treatments for depression. So that's, again, that Dr. C administered that. It was kind of somewhat effective, but didn't last, which is one of the downsides of ketamine. The doctors can't get their handle on why it doesn't last, why they can't keep it being effective. Then certainly the granddaddy of all the treatment options I tried is deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is becoming more and more prominent. It's actually recognized for Parkinson's disease at Health Canada, as I think there's 40,000 people across Canada who have tried it for and used it for Parkinson's. They're in the last few years of reaching out a little further to try it for depression. So this was at Toronto General Hospital. And think of a pacemaker for the heart, everybody's familiar with that, but this is a pacemaker for the brain. Same logic, really. And so they drill a couple of holes in your head physically and insert a couple electrodes and insert a battery in your chest, and away you go. In fact, I still have the little bumps from my surgery. Anyway, feel like a bit of a deer with an antlers or something. But anyway, that's just why I don't have any hair to cover it, unfortunately. So anyway, this was kind of interesting. I was part of research, which was kind of interesting. It was research candidate #1, actually. And this was the surgeon, Dr. Andres Lozano. He was a surgeon, world renowned. He was on 60 Minutes. They interviewed him about the same time as I was having the surgery. So very credible. And I thought to myself, if it's, not bad for a guy from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia to have this guy look after you. Anyway, that's what, just not me, but that's just the idea. They put a kind of a crown on your head kind of thing to keep your head stabilized. And the surgery took, I don't know, I was awake during the whole time. I felt like a lector, I think it was a Hannibal Lecter scene where he cuts the guy open. But anyway, the end result wasn't particularly effective. So that was disappointing, but I thought it worked at first, but I don't think so. But anyway, those are some of the professional measures. And this led to Dr. Chanasita. He probably doesn't remember this, but this is true. He said, and I didn't know if I should take this as badge of honor or what I should. Yeah, most treatment resistant patient. Now I didn't just sit on my butt and look for Dr. Chan to see me solve my issues. I took a number of self-help measures. I moved 3 times. I moved to Edmonton after high school as a way of, that was before I was diagnosed, but it was a way of trying to find myself. And I found that your problems kept with you. I moved to Edmonton again after university, again the same result. And although I used to tell people I moved to Chatham, reasons that many Maritimers obviously have, Eastons have done, that really wasn't the case with me. I moved here to try to find myself. That's plain and simple, but it wasn't effective. This isn't a self-help measure, but he reached out to alternative measures like homeopathic doctor. I went to Barrie for that, and it wasn't effective. They had their concoction of herbs and spices, so to speak. And anyway, it wasn't effective. Self-help books, I read those galore, and it was a little bit frustrating because the self-help books, quite often tell you 7 steps to treat depression. Anyway. It really wasn't effective for me. Anyway, post-secondary education, I'll expand on that briefly in a minute. But I took those measures, especially after I moved to Chatham, to better myself and feel better about myself. And so that's an option that I pursued. Exercise to the extreme. I'd always heard that exercise helps relieve depression, so I took that to the extreme. I'll talk about that in a sec. And then writing the book that we're, talk a little briefly today. It actually started off as a self-help measure, as I read that if you have, issues in your head and you write them on paper, then you feel better. And then it was somewhat therapeutic. And then when COVID hit a couple of years ago, I thought, mental health issues are much more prominent. Maybe there's a message out here I can share. So. Oh, okay. So, what is Breaking Free of Depression? So that's the book. It's 425 pages, and it chronicles my journey. I've lived with depression and anxiety, but mostly depression for over 45 years. So again, since grade 10. And details of professional and self-help measures I've undertaken, which I just went through briefly. It also tells what I learned, what I didn't learn, the interpersonal issues I encountered along the way, and roles friends and family played. So it's not a magical cure book by any means, but shares the journey. So it's a little bit interesting. And it was just published a month or 2 ago, so it's just freshly out. So the audience for the book is really anyone with depression. As I mentioned earlier, depression affects 280 million people worldwide. But it's interesting characteristic of depression, you feel like you're the only person who has depression. It's so lonely, it's unbelievable. But so hopefully this would help someone with depression that they understand they're not alone. Also, if you know somebody with depression, because it's very difficult to understand what somebody's going through who's dealing with depression. Hopefully this would help them understand. And then also just a general understanding, if you want to know what depression is all about. You have a general understanding. I find the commercials on television, and I find it's overkill. They've gone from one extreme to another. 10 years ago, you didn't hear about mental health issues. Now it seems like every second commercial is depression and mental health, but they're very vague. They're just kind of just general. It doesn't give you an understanding what you're dealing with. So hopefully this book would provide some insight to that. The book's message, which is, it's quite subtle, doesn't bonk you on the head, but it's one of hope, frankly. It's that a person can lead a productive family life, career, and personal life despite living with depression. So that's the message. It doesn't bonk the head, that's what it is. Some of the productive aspects I think I kind of accomplished, not to sound but I do have my Bachelor of Commerce degree, and I did that before I moved to Ontario. But since that time, I just had my CPA designation and the CFP designation, and then I also obtained my MBA when I was 55 years old. So I talked about extreme exercise measures, and so in the late 90s, 1998, I think it was, I took up running, and is a New Year's resolution. In fact, it might have been at Donna's New Year's house on New Year's Eve. It made a resolution to run a marathon as a really self-help measure, the extreme exercise. And I ended up running 5 marathons after age 38. So, and one was like New York City Marathon, Chicago Marathon, and so forth. But when that wasn't enough to make me feel better, I thought, well, escalate the challenge and run triathlon. So I signed up. I bought a bike at the Smith's bicycle up here, used one, Bumblebee yellow color one for $150. But it was a road bike. So I bought it and started training at the YMCA for swimming. And I ran 3 triathlons that summer and was aged almost 42 years old. And one of them was a half Ironman triathlon. If you're not familiar with that, you swim 2 hours, bike 90 kilometers, and then run a half marathon. So I did it in 6.5 hours. And, but that was the end of my triathloning. I thought, I can't do anything more than that. And so I haven't ridden the bike since. But it was a self-help measure to the extreme. Looking for ways to feel better, and that was just one of them. Traveled to 10 provinces, all 10 of them, and all 50 states, so that's kind of interesting. I also lecture at Fanshawe College, and I retired as a senior vice president of finance at Main Street. It's kind of interesting there because I started off in accounting sort of kind of thing. We were $20 million in assets in 1987 at Eugene Gasco. When I retired in 2019, we were close to $1 billion in assets under administration and 13 branches in Sarnia, up as far as Goderich. And so I was very pleased with that. And I stopped into the credit union yesterday to say hello to some people, and the time changed. It's 3 years next month that I retired, but anyway, all is good. As far as the book goes, so the objective is to share the story, and again, as I mentioned earlier, it's non-academic or clinical terms. I'll leave that to the Dr. Chandler Seams of the world. And then also the objective is hopefully people have better understanding that people with depression, that depression is as real as diabetes, for example, or as cancer. There's still some thought out there that with depression, it's character flaw, whatever, that's just really not a physical illness, but it is, it's real. I know that, I keep up on the reading, and they're pretty close to a blood test that will reveal, confirm, or quantify that depression does exist. So it won't help solve the puzzle, but it'll substantiate the fact that it really does exist. So, as well as the objective, of course, is to give hope to depression sufferers. So, where to buy? Here's my sales pitch. It is available locally. Turns the tail sense of Chandler, or at least Chandler's over there. Bookstore on Saturday went extremely well. As I mentioned earlier, it was very gratifying to return to that, and great place to stay. We have a coffee, board game, so forth. Chandler, well done. Chad needs that. It's available there. Unfortunately, I pretty well sold out on the weekends, so I'll have to resupply more books to them. I also have a website, brucerross.ca. It's a little bit clumsy. Unfortunately, Bruce Ross that domain was taken, so R is stuck in there. The middle name's fine, Scottish name Rotter. And of course, everything is available on Amazon and available paperback and ebook. Just the final words on it. There's no, as I mentioned, I think earlier, there's no preaching judgment of magic cures. That's not what it is, but it does share a journey and does have an underlying message of hope. So I think that's it, folks. Oh, the last thing, I've had a number of TV and radio interviews in the last several months, especially in conjunction with the Let's Talk campaign with Bell Canada. You know, the interviewers always ask me, the final question was, how do you feel today? Good question. Dr. Chandrasena switched me to Rexulti in last spring, early summer. Rexulti's been on the market for some time. It's fairly new, but he switched me to that. I wasn't particularly optimistic because of all the other things I've been through, but lo and behold, it has reduced the amount of symptoms for sure. I like to consider it, or the analogies, it's acting like a dike. You know, how a dike holds back the water. You know, the water's still there on the other side of the dike. I know depression is still there on the other side of the dike, so to speak, the mental leg. I hope the Rexulti continues to hold it back. So it certainly alleviated those symptoms. Unfortunately, the physical symptoms remain. You know, minimal appetite, sleep issues, and fatigue, which I've always had, well, since high school. It has added a couple new to the mix. Lightheadedness, which is apparently a fairly standard, so to speak, symptom of or side effect, I guess, of Rexulti. And also have nausea, which is a bit of a challenge. And that's not a characteristic of Rexulti, so it might be something else unrelated, but it's there. But the end result is there's really a trade-off I've had to make between my mental health and my physical health. But I decided unequivocally that I'm going to go with the mental health because I'd rather, have that be somewhat pain-free and deal with physical issues and live with that. So that's kind of interesting trade-off. But I don't hear of it in that term very often, that terminology, but that's what it feels like. And I think that's, oh my goodness, that's it. So I had to do this for Cheryl. Right? Cheryl made the journey to Chatham with me. So, and this night's picture of the three of us, it's Hannah, obviously, and this was actually in Thornbury, which is the next town over from Meaford, with, of course, Collingwood, the Blue Hill ski in the background, ski hills in the background. So I love the picture. I think it's great, and I'm very fortunate to have the family I have. So what can I say? So I think that's it.
Anyone have any questions if they would like to say it loud, and maybe we'll pick it up on
Sure.
Zoom.
I don't have a question. I just have a couple of comments.
Yeah.
I bought your book on Saturday.
Right.
And I'm about halfway
Oh,
through.
yeah.
And having parents that came from Halifax,
Right.
Nova Scotia area, my husband with deep brain stimulation.
Oh,
There
yeah.
are so many similarities.
Oh, was
There
there?
were points at which I wanted to call you and say, and I laughed out loud at some of the antics that you went through as a teenager and the travels that you went through. I'm not going to give it away because I want everybody to buy the book.
Yeah.
But where you've been
Yeah.
and what you've experienced is like 4 lifetimes.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's interesting you mentioned that because the draft of the book, those earlier life events, some of them were a little cruder, but funnier, or in my mind. But my publisher edited them. Yeah, and I thought, gee, she has no sense of humor. But anyway, yeah, that's the interesting ride, certainly for sure. And Yeah, thank you for those comments. Yeah.
Les, did you have?
Well, just recently they've been talking about magic mushrooms
All right,
therapy.
is that right?
I know when I was younger, I tried that.
Yeah.
I never felt better.
Yeah, yeah.
Want me to hit stop
Serious.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that actually, so that's interesting, yeah. I know they're trying lots of different options, yeah.
I've been trying to follow them.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah. Yes, Colin.
I think, I'm like a lot of people, I don't like winter as much as summer, you know, but, you know, it's dark, the weather isn't as nice, but how would we know if we actually suffer from SAD or if it's just a normal thing?
Yeah, that'd be a Dr. C question, I think probably. I know I bought one of the Lux lights, what they call it, the lights, artificial lights to try to improve my mood and, you know, kind of steer the thing for half an hour.
I mean, if you feel better in the summer, it's not a full-blown depression like this. It doesn't matter what time of year. You know what I mean? So there's that. I mean, you can just feel down and start, you know, but his didn't matter.
No.
What season it was.
Or what event took place. As I mentioned this in my book, Cheryl and I went to see Jay Leno in Toronto a number of years ago. And I still remember because we had seats like from media away from the stage, and it was awesome entertainment. But when I was leaving the theater, I remember thinking, you know, I'm so sad. There's something wrong. There was something just fundamentally wrong. It was just something, yeah. So didn't matter what event it was, it just wasn't there.
Hey, Bruce.
Yes, Don.
Dr. Chandrasena would like to say some comments. I just caught that on the chat.
Sure. Fire away, go ahead.
Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Dr. C.
Sorry, I couldn't be there in person. Today is my day for some medical legal assessments, and they've been booked way in advance, but I wouldn't miss your presentation.
Thank you.
A couple of things I just want to address the audience is that I've known Bruce for 22 years, and his story is that of humbleness, and where he has gone through a lot of depression, but in that journey, he has helped many patients. And he had done that by looking at this disease and putting it in context of one's life. This is an illness which majority of the patients will get better in 60 or 80 weeks, and they get back to functional recovery. Small proportion of patients, about 4,000 of them will kill themselves, and majority of them have clinical depression. So that's the other end of the spectrum. And then there are people like Bruce, whose illness just does not get better. People often talk about treatment refractory depression. But what Bruce brings to all of us is during that journey, you can have what we refer to as functional recovery. In spite of the illness, you can lead your life to the fullest, whether it is running marathons, contributing to other people's wellness, joining the Rotary and advocating to on behalf of a lot of disadvantaged youth and people, leading a full, wholesome family life and things. And that is very important message. The second thing Bruce brings to us is that if we just looked at the last 10, not the 20 years, and see how much advances we have made in the treatment, all of which we have been able to offer you. I know we discussed this, you have hope what we can bring to over the next 10 years. There's many things are happening, inclusive of things, psychedelic medications such as psilocybin, which is magic mushroom, that's been tried, which offer true clinical hope. And I think that, you know, on behalf of the journey you have taken me through, giving me hope to look after other patients like you and the ones that you have counseled directly, Bruce. Your book gives us a lot of hope, and continue with that. You and people like Margaret Trudeau who have gone through this journey, destigmatize mental illness and make a tremendous contribution to the welfare of the mentally ill. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Dr. C. Paul?
Bruce, thank you again for sharing such a personal thing and a personal journey with all of us. And I must say, you don't fit the stereotype of someone that's
No.
depressed. I look at you, your successful career, successful marriage and family
Mm.
life. And I wouldn't have known it until you did your first presentation. You know, that you had depression. Because to me,
Yeah.
it's not obvious.
Yeah.
Are you constantly having to fight this in your public life? And if so, where do you find the energy to do that?
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul, because I actually alluded to that several times in the book, because over the years, I felt like a bit of a facade or clown. You know, a clown puts on a happy face, goes and smiles, then you go back home and kind of pull the shades and so forth. So I felt the same way, you know, but a bit of a mask, I guess, to put on to go out in public, but then kind of relieved when I go back home and kind of be by myself or, you know, whatever. So yeah, it's been a challenge for sure. On 60 Minutes a number of years ago, I saw Jim Carrey. He was interviewed and he said depression quite significant. And I thought it was just kind of interesting. Here's a guy with a zany comedy that act that he puts on, but he said he used to have to masquerade some of his mental health issues. So yeah, it's been a challenge for sure. Yeah. Constant struggle.
You must take a lot of energy.
A lot of energy for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Bruce, I would like to thank you for your book and your talk. And I suffered from anxiety
Okay. Yeah.
and depression for a long time, probably since I was a teenager.
Oh, wow. Good.
And but I would like to, it's interesting when you're going through the list of the treatments.
Yeah.
I went through a lot of those
Yeah.
too, but I usually tested positive. Like sleep apnea. Yeah, you got sleep apnea.
Right.
It's like, oh, okay. So I've got to put the CPAP machine on. But I was also treated by Dr. John Racine as well. And what I'd like to say is that the treatment that I had with Dr. John Racine actually really worked really
Okay.
well.
Good. Yeah.
And so the combination of some antidepressants and also cognitive behavior
Right.
therapy and these things actually helped me a lot.
Okay.
But I'd like to, also second the fact that there are lots of people that really just are very successful,
Right.
that go through their lives, do
That's right.
really well.
Yeah.
But also second that with that to a lot of people, I see a lot of people in my practice that have not had treatment, that
Right.
haven't seen anyone gotten any help, and mostly men, and just sit there and watch their lives get destroyed.
Right.
And they're, have really sad lives. And I encourage them to get treated.
Right.
And because usually something works.
Yeah, that's right.
And even if it doesn't just work, like in terms of the magic pill that
Right.
everything is great, it at least allows you to work and function in relationships
Yeah.
and live a life.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, for sure. There's not one size fits all, but it's certainly something, you have to have hope that something will eventually help you out. But you have to reach out. That's quite often I get asked the question, what do you recommend for somebody who has depression or thinks they have depression? The number one thing is to accept it. And then only then can you move on. That's, pretty standard of any treatment, but that's so true with depression. Just accept it and then you get on with it.
And I found that with the antidepressants, they were of a sudden I slept.
Oh,
I
okay.
never slept
Yeah, yeah,
before.
yeah.
You know, all of
Yeah.
a sudden I slept, and it was like I slept for about 2 weeks straight.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. It was like, wow, this is sleeping. The anxiety was
Yeah.
a bigger issue for me. than
Yeah, for
depression.
sure, yeah.
And so all of a sudden I slept and I didn't worry.
Yeah.
And the general anxiety disorder, people don't understand, is that you just worry all the
Yeah.
time.
Oh,
And if you don't have something to worry about, you make something up.
right, exactly, yeah,
And it makes something else to worry about.
yeah,
And
that's right.
even now, it's more like, that was in my dreams. It doesn't happen during the day, but the dreams, I have the same sort of dreams. But but they can help a lot.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's,
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I know it helped me a lot.
So we just want to thank everybody and our friends that have joined us on Zoom, and we're going to say better late than never, but Barry Fraser has just shown up from someplace way up north where it must be a different time zone, Barry, as we're about to say goodbye. But we want to thank everybody for joining us. We're just going to stop our recording and